One day, Edward went to a farm to treat a sick milkmaid. There had been smallpox outbreaks in the area, so Edward suggested she get varulated to protect herself. That's when the milkmaid said something that would change the course of history forever. "Well, I can't get smallpox," she said. "I've already had cowpox." Cowpox is a virus that grows on cows' udders. It can be transmitted across a variety of animals such as cats and rodents, but it can also be passed on to humans who come into contact with the sores. If a milkmaid touched the udders of a sick cow, there was a chance they would contract cowpox, grow lesions on their hands, develop a mild illness, and usually recover just fine, with the added benefit of smallpox immunity. It turned out that the milkmaid was correct, but it would be decades before Edward would realize it. Edward completed his training, and at just age 21 years old, he packed his bags and secured a new apprenticeship with Mr. John Hunter in London. The city was thriving through the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, with thousands of immigrants hungry for work crammed into tiny apartments lining filthy roads. It was a chaotic mixture of languages, races, faiths, and of course, disease. Smallpox was everywhere, killing people faster than they could be buried, leaving piles of dead bodies along the roads. Edward hated it, but for an ambitious young doctor, London was the place to be, and John Hunter took Edward under his wing, eager to expose him to the newly emerging world of human anatomy with hundreds and hundreds of dissections. But how did surgeons procure dead bodies back then? Were these corpses donated to scientific research via person's will ethically? Nope. By and large, cadavers in the 18th century came from body snatchers who would scour the streets and graveyards looking for fresh bodies to sell to anatomists for cold, hard cash. One of Edward's jobs was to wait in the lab at night for the body snatchers to come knocking at the door, showing off the dead bodies they had to sell that evening. Here you thought Facebook Marketplace was sketchy. Over the years, the two men grew quite close, and Edward learned a ton about the human body. As they neared the end of Edward's apprenticeship, Hunter actually offered him an official position. And while Edward was flattered, he knew that London was not where he belonged. He dreamed of being back home as a country physician, treating the common people on the farms, and continuing to study wildlife. Fortunately for us, he did just that. With a brain full of knowledge, Edward returned to the countryside and started his new life. He established his own medical practice and treated the sick and injured in the small villages that dotted the British countryside. It was on one of his long country horseback rides that an old idea began percolating in the back of his mind. The connection between cowpox and smallpox that he had learned about many years ago. He brought the subject up around colleagues and friends, and they laughed in his face. Sure, some farmers said they never got smallpox after having cowpox, but then again, some said the opposite. But to Edward, that was the point. Sometimes it did work, but why? Sadly, Edward couldn't test his hypothesis. Smallpox outbreaks came in waves, and in rural England, you could go years without seeing a single case. Likewise, cowpox was also relatively rare. To get to the bottom of this, he would need both a cowpox and smallpox outbreak to happen exactly at the same time. Good luck. So, Edward put the word out to all of southwest England that if a farmer's cow presented lesions on its udders, he had to know about it. Edward would ride miles, day and night, through stifling heat and pouring rain to examine a sick cow. As time went on, Edward's knowledge of cowpox improved, his notebooks filled up, and he developed a strong understanding of the disease. Now all he needed was a patient with smallpox. Unfortunately, Edward would have to wait 20 more years. This big break came in 1796. The story goes that a milkmaid named Sarah Nelm scratched her finger on a thorn before milking a cow that was sick with cowpox. Her open wound came in contact with the cow's lesions, transferring the virus into her body. Sarah quickly fell ill, and Edward was called. Luckily, smallpox cases had also been reported in the area. After 2 decades, the timing was finally right. This was the opportunity he dreamed of. He raced to the farm and began treating Sarah, who had developed lesions and a ferocious fever. Fortunately, she rested and recovered just in time for Edward to scrape a sample of that cowpox lesion on her arm. Then, Edward galloped to the home of James Phipps, a local child and son of his gardener, who had never come into contact with smallpox. With permission from the boy's father, Edward created the incision in the boy's arm and exposed him to the cowpox lesions he had harvested from Sarah the milkmaid. A week later, James began developing symptoms of a cowpox infection. He had swelling in his armpit, a fever, lesions on his arm. His condition worsened, leaving him bedridden while his parents lay sleepless at night. Had they just sentenced their son to death in a foolish attempt to test a scientific hypothesis? As these thoughts raced through their heads, James' condition began to improve. His fever abated, his energy and appetite returned, his sores on his arms scabbed over and fell off. A few more days later, he felt normal. 4 weeks later, Edward returned to James's house and performed the procedure once more. This time, he made another incision in James's arm and he rubbed up ground smallpox lesions into the wound. And then, nothing. Absolutely no reaction whatsoever. James was truly immune. He'd done it. Edward quickly wrote a paper detailing his experiment on James Phipps and sent it off to his colleagues in London. Surely word of Edward's carefully performed experiment would sweep the city, end variolation for good, and soon rid the world of smallpox entirely. Well, not quite. Edward's paper was immediately rejected. Science in the 1790s was a far cry from what it is today, but even back then there was easy criticism of his experiment. He had an N of 1. He tested one kid. Surely a larger trial and much more evidence would be needed before it would be formally accepted by London's movers and shakers. But Edward wasn't deterred. He kicked his research into high gear, exposing numerous patients to cowpox, then to smallpox. He made progress. Time and time again, he showed that surviving a mild cowpox infection would protect a person against smallpox. He compiled the data and had his peers carefully review his findings. Finally, in 1798, Edward Jenner finished his masterpiece, a short pamphlet entitled An Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae, a disease discovered in some of the western counties of England, particularly Gloucestershire and known by the name of the cowpox, or the Inquiry for short. Pamphlet in hand, Edward headed to London for the first time in 25 years to have his work published and distributed among the medical community, all at his own expense. Yet again, it was not received well. First, while Edward's discovery may have been correct, there was still no logical explanation for it. Remember, the discovery of microorganisms was still decades away. No doctor on the planet knew about bacteria, viruses, or germs because at this point, microscopes were not commonly used in medicine. You have to admit, a man saying that touching the disgusting wounds on a sick cow's udders would protect you from the world's deadliest disease just cuz was pretty out there. Second, cowpox vaccination would be a death blow to the highly profitable variolation industry, which lined the pockets of many London doctors. As Upton Sinclair once said, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. Lastly, while the inquiry may have been generally correct, it contained some errors. Edward claimed that cowpox exposure inoculated a person against smallpox for life, which wasn't true. It only provided protection for around 7 years. The randomized controlled trials of rural England in 1790 hadn't been run long enough, I guess. Despite the skepticism from the medical community, it did catch the attention of one pretty powerful individual, the King of England. That's right, King George III from Hamilton. Edward was granted an audience with the king, an impossibly high honor. He had to prepare. First, he had a special, newly revised version of the inquiry printed, lavishly bound, including a new introduction that showed great admiration for the king himself. He basically used the 1790s version of Canva. Next, he did what any self-respecting scientist would do. He went shopping. Edward arrived at St. James Palace in London dressed to the nines. He wore a new velvet suit, silk stockings, and a sword. I wish I dressed like this for my residency interviews. Well, I kinda did. Edward was escorted through the halls of the palace into the king's meeting chambers. The proper etiquette was that Edward was not to speak until the king did so first, so he waited. King George looked him up and down until finally, after an awkward silence, he broke the ice, and Edward began his carefully prepared presentation of smallpox. Before he could get anything out, however, the king stopped him and asked him a peculiar question. Dr. Jenner, do you enjoy music? Edward was confused. Music? What? Yes, he replied. I'm quite fond of music. Are you, Your Highness? Absolutely, the king replied. I'm personally a fan of concert music. The king could not have cared less about Edward's work on smallpox. Fortunately, because of Edward's years living in London with Mr. Hunter, he was able to play along. Edward and the king swapped stories about their favorite songs and composers, and Edward even talked about a few of the instruments that he knew how to play. King George was delighted. And then he left. The king retired to his private quarters, and Edward was ushered away.
My work is easy because I use Google. Here's how I keep track of all my tasks. I start by brain dumping everything I need to get done in a list view. Next, I set a priority and a due date to keep things on track. I create custom statuses to organize my progress exactly how I want it. I like to add the action items field so AI can show me the next steps. I add my teammates as watchers so they're in the loop. ClickUp makes work easy, from personal projects to running a multi-billion-dollar company. Click the link below to create your workspace for free.
What just happened? Edward got one meeting with the king and fumbled the bag talking about music? He should have pushed back and insisted he talk about smallpox. He sulked the entire way out of the palace, defeated. In his private quarters, the king told his wife, Queen Charlotte, about the delightful doctor he had just met with. We discussed music. He's got great taste, the king boasted. Yes, but why was he here? The queen replied. Oh, he claims to have done some work on smallpox. Something about a cure? I'm not really sure. The queen sighed, gave her husband a small kiss on the forehead, and immediately insisted that Edward be brought back to the palace for another meeting, where he explained his findings in great detail. The queen was moved. Her sons Prince Octavius and Prince Alfred had died from smallpox variolation 15 years prior. For her, this was personal. The queen listened to Edward's presentation and swept into action, securing the English monarchy's endorsement of the inquiry. It turns out, the Queen of England was quite the influencer, and thankfully ignoring the previous